Hello, my fellow comic book collectors. Today is Wednesday, and I do my Q&A videos on Wednesday where you get to ask me whatever questions you want about comics, and I, the next week, answer them, basically. So if you comment on this video, I will answer it next week. So last week, I had some really great questions that I'm going to answer. The first comes from Vlob Great. Would love to see what your favorite comic book covers that were drawn by who you think are underappreciated artists. For instance, no Kirby, no Cole, no Wood or Baker. Okay, so the artist that I was thinking was Ken Baub. And he is really a great artist that is often overlooked or sort of maybe lost from the golden age. But he is an artist that I think deserves some recognition, and he actually has lots of recognition. He's not like some unknown artist, but he is great. He was born in August 1st, 1920, and he died in 2019. And he actually has a bit of a Canadian connection. I'm Canadian, so I always like artists that have a bit of a Canadian connection. Though he was born in New York, he actually studied at the University of Ontario, the Ontario College of Art, I should say, sometime in his early career. That's his bit of a Canadian connection. That the Ontario College of Art is actually located in Toronto, so near me. So I didn't know him though. Okay, so he got his start actually at when he moved to Englewood in New York, and he worked at the studio of Jack Binder. Now, Jack Binder, what their studio would do is kind of similar to the Iger studio. What they would do is what's called packagers. They would have packagers that would basically, other comic companies would order a complete comic, and they would basically create it for them. So that's what their job was. And he was an artist that was very, very prolific in the 40s. He did have to go. He went in 1942, though. He went off to become a Marine to join the war effort. A lot of really famous artists, a lot of talented artists went overseas. And he was a Marine. He went over to Japan, to fight against the Japanese, and he stayed there until 1946. When he returned, he got back into comics, and he was actually pretty active. He worked, so some of the comics that you would know him from would be like Captain America, Submariner, Blonde Phantom, Miss America, Nomura. And he was actually they're not sure if he actually created Nomura or if he was the one that, because his pencils were used on the cover, but the interior art was by Bob Powell. And so it's not really 100% sure who was the one that really was the artist that created Nomura, because sometimes the cover is done first, sometimes the interior is done first. So it's a little bit iffy who did her first. But it could be that he was the one that was involved with the creation of that character. So he also did a lot of good girl art. He worked on Millie the Model, Georgie, Patsy Walker. And he also was involved with creation of Sun Girl. That was one of his creations, Sun Girl, which is another great Golden Age comic. During the 60s, he did a comic strip called Dr. Kildare, and he did that all the way up into 1984. So it was a very long-running strip. Actually, it even had a very short-lived TV series based on it. But it was originally created as a pulp, so he wasn't the one that created Dr. Kildare, so I'm not saying that. But he is the one that was the artist that continued it during the 60s. In 1971, though, he was the one that created a strip called Dark Shadows. And there was a TV series based on his strip, which is kind of cool. So he's kind of known for those two strips, like Dr. Kildare and also Dark Shadows. The funny thing is, he sort of retired soon after, like in the early 80s, he kind of retired. But then he was asked to do a cover. And he did the cover for a variant cover. It's like a 1 in 25 cover for the Contest of Champions book number 2. Okay, so that's Ken Ball's work on that cover. It's actually a really cool cover. It has some of the characters that he's known for. So that, though, made him the oldest artist and cover artist, which was recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records in 2017. So he did that cover in 2016. And 2017, he was recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records as the oldest comic book artist and oldest comic artist to illustrate a cover. That was his official title. And that was when at the age of 96. So I thought that was kind of cool. So that's, a brief history of him. I always like, when I do these kind of artist spotlights, I always like to do that rundown of their history. Now I'm going to show you some of the covers that I have that feature his artwork. So this one is actually a joint project that he did. And I mentioned that he was probably one of the ones that was involved with the creation of Nomura. Well, here's a Submariner book that has both the artwork of Ken Ball and Sid Shores. So it's kind of like a mixture of the two artists. So this is Submariner number 24. Geez, I'm messing all the numbers up. But this is one of my favorite covers from the Submariner run. I know there's lots of really great ones, but this one I like the most. I like the girl in the red dress. So, and then we got, this is the one where I was talking about. This is Nomura's first appearance, and this is cover art by Ken Ball. This is Marvel Mystery Comics number 82. And, there's Nomura coming out of the water there. So, kind of a cool cover. And then we got another Ken Ball, Nomura. So I really like Nomura, so I have a bunch of his artwork for her. And she even has the little wings on her legs, on her feet. Okay, so this is Nomura number 1. I kind of like his style. I kind of associate it with that sort of 40s good girl style, so I kind of like it. See. And I mentioned this character, Sun Girl. Here's a copy of Sun Girl. Sun Girl number 3. Which is kind of cool. And I like this one. It's like she's swinging on the thing and the guy's cutting cutting the trapeze, which is kind of cool. And another Sun Girl. Sun Girl number 2. I'm still looking for Sun Girl number 1. So if anyone has Sun Girl number 1, please send it my way. But yeah, so Sun Girl number 2. That's another Ken Ball. And some of his good girl art. This is my only signed Golden Age artist. This is Cindy number 30, and I just happened to have it signed by Ken Ball right there. I didn't personally get it signed. I bought it signed, but it is a verified signature, so I thought that was kind of cool. There was actually a really great auction on Heritage where they're basically, somebody had basically, they must have taken like 50 books to a signing where Ken Ball was there, and they later, they auctioned them off later. So there was a whole bunch of these. So it was kind of interesting. But very rare to get his signature, verified signature by him. So those were some of my favorite Ken Ball artwork. And there's a lot more. I mean, as I said, he was involved with a lot of early timely books, and he did a lot of these good girl art covers. So just a really great artist, one that I like a lot. So you know, that would be my choice. If you want me to do other artists, just put a comment below, and I'll do a little spotlight on any artist that somebody wants me to do. Okay. Next question comes from Matt Blogs. Are there any comics that were known to have been printed, but no copy is known to exist? Okay, so that's a really great question. So what happened was, there's a bit of a story around this one. There was a time period where a lot of the Golden Age comics really people didn't know about. If you went and you actually picked up the Overstreet Guide, they would have like literally like they would put it as like number 1 would always be a really expensive price. Number 2 to 5 they would put it at a different price, and maybe 2 to or 5 till 20 would be another price. And they just grouped all the books based on what issue number they were. And maybe if it had a first appearance, well, they would kind of highlight that book. But for the most part, there really wasn't a way of knowing what those books looked like, first of all, because it was just all text in these Overstreet guides. So the early guides and the early information that people had about books was very limited. We didn't know, we didn't know what the covers were like, and we didn't really know what covers were cool and which were not cool. So if you look at the early guides, a lot of these covers that are like comics that really go for huge value were just lumped in with other random comics. So what happened was there was a change that happened, and it was the Gerber's Guide, the photo journal that came out. And it basically changed kind of overnight the way people viewed comics from the Golden Age. Because what they did was Gerber basically went around and he went to these people that had these massive Golden Age collections, and he photographed all their comics, and he created a journal of just covers like that pretty much has all of the Golden Age covers known to exist. So with that said, he basically, from his experience, because he would see like dozens of copies of certain comics, and sometimes there would be very few of others. And sometimes he could even find a cover, but he knew that the comic existed and that there were people out there that had it, but he didn't get a cover of it, and he would just put a sort of a blank image. So the point is, he basically came up with a scarcity guide as well to go with this journal. And in the journal, you could basically see like a numbering system associated with each comic. And the numbering system went from 1 all the way to 11. Now, 1, and I wrote it down because it's a fairly long thing, but I'll read it to you and it'll make sense. 1 is like an uncommon or modern book. Okay, so if you go to the comic book shop, well, those would be 1 on the scarcity index, because you can pick them up anywhere, right? A 2 would be sort of so 1 is very common, 2 is common, like an 80s book. You can pick up 80s books pretty easily. Maybe you have to look, for certain ones you might have to look a little harder, but not that hard. Okay, so that's a 2. A 3 is more than average. Okay, so there's more of them than average, but they're getting a little bit more scarce. So like 70s books, maybe some of the like in the 60s might be a little bit more scarce, but you can find them. Okay, so that's a 3. Now a 4 is average scarcity. Now average scarcity is anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 copies known to exist. And a 5, which is the next level, is less than average scarcity, and that runs from around 200 copies known to exist to 1,000 copies known to exist. And a 6 is uncommon, and that's 50 to 200. A 7 is Scarce, and that's 21 to 50 copies. 8 is Rare, and that's 11 copies to 20 copies. And a 9 is Very Rare, and that's 6 copies to 10 copies. And 10 is Unique, and that's when it's less than 5 copies known to exist. And then last one is 11, and that is non-existent. So they know that it's been printed, but none have been found to still exist. Now, you would think, okay, so those are the guides. That's the numbering system, 1 through 11. How many books inside the photojournal actually got an 11? Well, none. Even the ones where they couldn't get a photo for it, none of them got that elusive number 11 on the scarcity index. Because from what I can understand, there aren't any books that have been known to not exist, that they couldn't find a representation of it somewhere in somebody's collection. So maybe there's only a few copies, a handful of copies, but they were able to find them. So from what I can understand, there's no absolutely non-existent comic out there. But I figured, hey, why not show some examples from my own personal collection of the different scarcity levels? Okay, so I mentioned a Gerber 5, and a Gerber 5 is where it's like around 1,000 copies known to exist, give or take. And this is an example of a Gerber 5, A Date with Millie. Okay, so this is Dan DiCarlo art, and this is a reasonably rare book. So according to the scale, it would be considered a 5 is less than average. Okay, so so this is less than average. And if you think about it, like any book where there's like where they deliberately make only 300 copies, well, that adds to the scarcity. So this is a reasonably scarce book. And then we got one that would surprise people how rare this one is, but this is a rare book. This is what would be considered a Gerber. This would be a Gerber 5 or Gerber 6, probably a Gerber 5 still. This only has less than 300 copies graded, which is Albedo number 2, which is, it's a fairly modern book. It's from 1984, so it would be considered Copper Age, but it's a fairly rare book. It's even more rare than Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 1, which is, maybe a Gerber 6, Gerber 4, because it's actually more common. This is much more rare. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then we got a more rare book, Funny Stuff number 1. This is my McSnurdle first appearance book. And this is actually the highest graded copy on the census. And it's a Carson City pedigree. And there's only, how many of them are known to exist? I think it was 8. Yeah, only 8 known to exist. Now, you're probably wondering, how about Action 1? Like, what is the scarcity of that? Oh, so this is like, this would be considered a Gerber 9. So this is a Gerber 9. Well, Action Comics number 1 has 75 copies. Okay, so 75 copies would make it a Gerber 6. So fairly, almost as common as the Albedo, like Gerber 5 compared to Gerber 6. So that, I thought that was kind of interesting. Another one that what people probably think, oh, this is really scarce, hard to get book, would be something like AF15, like Amazing Fantasy 15. Well, Amazing Fantasy 15 is a very common book. It's actually in that common era because it has about 3,094 copies on the census. So it's a fairly common book. That would make it like Gerber 3, just to give you a sense of how common it is. Now, another kind of fun one is New Mutants 98. New Mutants 98 would be considered like almost a Gerber 1 because it's got like 25,000 copies on the census. So pretty common. A Spawn 1 would be another Gerber 1. Okay, so I'm going to show you some more books. I'm going to show you a Gerber 10 and a Gerber 9. So the first is, actually, these are both Gerber 10s. Sorry, I should actually correct myself. This is a Gerber 10 because there's only 3 known on the census, 3 copies on the census for this one. Now, whenever you see the census number, it's a little bit deceiving because sometimes the numbers can be much higher than what the census will say. But when it's a book like this, generally people will get them graded. So the census numbers, maybe if you double the number, you know, and the same goes with the Gerber Scarcity Guide. That usually a rule of thumb with the Gerber Scarcity Guide is to take the number and double it. So if they say less than 5 copies, well, it's really maybe less than 10. So I'm just giving you this as an example. This has 3 copies on the census. This is the mid-grade one. So kind of funny. This is Jughead number 1. And one that just has 1 copy on the census, that's in my collection, is this one. Whiz Comics, Volume 3, Number 6 from 1944. And this only has 1 on the census. And this is the highest graded copy on the census, which it doesn't mean anything, but it's just a very scarce book. There's probably less than 10 of these known to exist, I would say. Just because it's a Canadian white, and they just didn't really survive very well. So this is an example of a very scarce book. One that, you know, only has 1 on the census. So, you know, if it wasn't slabbed, then probably people would be like, oh, does it even exist? You know, maybe that would be an example. So yeah, so that is all I can say about that. Like in terms of like, I did some research. I tried to find like ones that they knew that they were printed, but no longer were out there in the wild. But for the most part, people have them somewhere, but maybe they haven't recently sold them. So a lot of these books that you see, especially from the Golden Age, just hide in people's collections. And you'll see that the last sale is like 20 years ago or something crazy. But for the most part, they're out there. They just, you know, hiding in people's collections. So I hope you enjoyed these answers to these questions. I'd love to hear some more questions from you. And if you want to give me any feedback about my answers, please do so in the comments below. And thanks again for watching. Bye for now.